Hi, everybody. It's Richard H. Stevens, fantasy author. Welcome to episode 9 of Lurking for Legends. Tonight, my wonderful co-host, historical suspense author Christy Stratos, and myself will be speaking to fantasy author Ken Schultz. And from one Canadian author to another, Ken, welcome to Lurking for Legends.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's definitely a pleasure. And before we get into grilling you with questions about what you do, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're writing?
Basically, I've been writing since I was in my early teens. Just recently, I've always wanted to write a book, a novel. So I got started on this series called The Songs of Arda. And I got started on it actually by accident. I was working for a construction company, home builders, who were employing me as a warranty service person. And I administrated their warranty service, and I sat down in a restaurant one afternoon having lunch, and I pulled out my computer, and I just decided I was going to do a creative writing exercise and describe what I was seeing outside the window. And that was the beginning of the Songs of Arda. And now I'm in the third book, and the fourth one is sort of about 50% done, and carrying on. There should be a fourth one and probably a fifth one in order to finish the story arc.
That's excellent. And it's really cool to hear how you started. You just sort of sat down and went with a creative writing prompt about writing what was around you. That is awesome. It was not just, hey, I have this fantasy idea, I'm going to attempt to write it. It sounds like that's like an easier, maybe like a softer way to get started. So is that something that you would recommend to writers who kind of feel like nervous about the blank page?
Well, I don't know if I'd recommend it or not. I'm a pantser. I fly by the seat of my pants, and that's just how I got started. Now that I'm into the third and the fourth, I'm finding that pantsing's not working quite so well anymore. I need to get an outline put together and start doing some serious planning.
I was wondering about that. Actually.
You know, as a start.
Yeah, I was going to ask
you may have noticed when you're editing the first one, it was a little bit helter-skelter.
I think all our first books are like that.
Yeah, literally everyone. But that's exactly, I'm so glad that you mentioned that you're a pantser, because I was going to ask you that. Mm-hmm. I find it like intimidating when I think about fantasy writing, although I don't write fantasy at this point. The idea of pantsing sounds like complicated, because there's so much to the world building, and your books are very complex in many ways, with really great character journeys, and there's a lot of real life topics that you deal with that are tricky, and you know, all that. And I was wondering like how you deal with it, as I assumed you were a planner, actually, based on what I had read.
Really?
Yeah.
Boy, I had you fooled.
Yeah, you did.
No, a lot of my stuff, early in the morning is my best time for writing or planning, because I do, and I'll just kind of zone out for about an hour or so, and these ideas will just come to me, and I'll start writing them down, and then things get more complex as I go along, and I'm thinking about little plot twists and little extra things. I mean, some of the characters that I thought were going to be fairly major characters in the whole grand scheme of things ended up dying in the first book, and some of the people that I thought were just sort of extras on the scene, their lives just started to interest me. And I'm thinking specifically of Ogun in my last book on Matto. They're starting to really become fairly interesting characters, because they've got so many conflicts going on, internal and external.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome that you mentioned that with the characters. They form a life of their own.
They do.
I've
got kind of like you get them in your head, and you need an exorcism to get rid of them.
Yeah, for sure. I've got some other characters too that have done the same thing, where they've just actually taken over the book and became, plot driving characters. So, and they were just like a byline in one of the scenes at the beginning. So that's really interesting that it's the same for you as well.
Yeah.
So Caroline Davidson. Caroline Davidson asking, what inspired you to write?
Life. I've always, even when I was a little kid, like I'm talking 4 and 5 years old, I learned to read very early. Probably by the time I was 5, I was reading at a grade 6 or 7 level, and the stories lifted me out of where I was, and I always wanted to do that and share that with other people, because it was just something that clicked with me. I was literate very early, and I just wanted to continue with it. Although, life got in the way for many years. I had a family to raise and money to make so that I could eat and have a place to live. And now that I've retired, it gives me the time that I can do that.
Yeah. And just to briefly go back to what you just said before about minor characters kind of taking on a life of their own and major characters dying. First of all, I think it's a really good sign that, a reader really can't expect everyone, just because they're main character, to be alive at the end of the book, which I really enjoy. I really enjoy that. And in your third book, when I saw these, what were minor characters in the second one, becoming full-fledged characters, major characters in the third, I was really excited about that. So, you sort of just go along with what your characters are telling you then, right? And so this is where you're needing to start planning, I guess.
Yes.
Okay.
It's very much what I write is character driven. It's I write them into corners, and then I have to figure out a way to get them out of the corner.
That's tough. That can be really tough.
Especially when you're a pantser, you haven't planned it.
Yeah. And I won't say that you take the easy way out either. And that can be tough to write. I know.
So as an epic fantasy author, there's so many different ways to write fantasy. I think fantasy's probably got to be the most labor-intensive way to write when it comes to world building and magic systems and all that. Do you put a lot of time into it? I know you said you're a pantser, but you're getting away from that. Do you spend a lot of time outside of writing world building and behind the scenes, or is this just something that your world develops as your story goes on?
Yeah, my world kind of develops as the story goes on. You'll start out with an idea about a character and where to go with this character, and then I have to populate the area around him to make it believable, to make it accessible. I remember when I first started writing in that. I was in one of the show homes one day, and I left my computer up and running, and the salesperson came in while I had to step out for a bit, and she started reading what I had written, and she just went, "Wow, I feel like I'm there."
That's great encouragement.
Yeah, it was. I never intended to publish. The idea was to write a story or stories and just have them for my kids and my grandkids to read. But my wife runs a bed and breakfast, and sometimes we have guests come by, and there was a couple from California that came in, and we were talking about literature and writing and stuff. I don't know how we got on that subject. But anyway, he wanted to read what I wrote, so I showed it to him, and he goes, "You have to publish this." And I was like, okay, I guess maybe I should.
So do you leave them around? Now you run a bed and breakfast. Do you leave the books out? And I imagine you have a common area there. That'd be very enticing to leave a few of your books out so the guests can pick them up and look.
Yeah, I haven't actually done it. I don't have any paper copies kicking around. I find that paperbacks are very tedious and time-consuming to format and get. It's a bit of a nightmare. If I could go ebooks only, that would be where I would go. I just find dealing with Amazon's printing session is just a nightmare for me. Today I've spent about 6 hours getting book 3 formatted and ready to go, and I'm still not done.
Yeah, it's very time-consuming. So you do the formatting yourself then?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
ebooks are just so much easier.
Mm-hmm.
They are.
So that's what I was going to ask you. One of the questions I want to ask you was, and do you print books at all then?
Yeah, I do have print books available through Amazon. They're
See,
about the only ones that I can afford to have printed books out there. You don't make really any money on print books, but not that I make any money on ebooks either, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah, I find as like Amazon, as Canadian authors, we're a little bit behind the curve as far as the Amazon, the way they roll things out. We just last year we became print on demand in Canada, but that doesn't mean that authors can get author copies on print on demand, and that would be a game changer as far as my own business. As far as ordering paperback books for myself, I do a lot of shows, and it's not cost effective for me to order my author copies through Amazon because Prime is only for one country, so you don't get the benefit of free shipping. And then you've got the U.S. exchange, which absolutely slays the Canadian dollar. And by the time I get the books here, I can't afford to sell them at a show at a good rate.
Exactly.
I think once Amazon gives author copies print on demand, I think it'll be a game changer for Canadian authors, but we're not quite there yet.
Well, I just tried to order one for the combined volume of books 1 and 2, and it accepted it. I don't know whether I'm actually going to get it or not, but it used to be that I couldn't get it at all. It would just it would say we can't deliver. And now suddenly, this was this week, actually, it just happened. So you might want to give that another go.
Mm-hmm.
But,
yeah, I've got a local printer I get my books through, and it's certainly more cost effective than ordering through Amazon. Unless I need a few copies, I'll order through Amazon just to get them quick, because it's amazing. You order today and you can get your print book in 1 or 2 days. It's sitting on my doorstep. I go, wow, that's incredible. So CJ Davis is wondering if you attend book signings or other book events. So I guess you'd have to have print books to be doing that. Have you attended one yet?
I had one early on when I had my first book out, and it wasn't a raging success. It was local, and it was at the end of winter, and it was the first nice day outside in a long time, so attendance was really pathetic.
Mm.
Sure.
And what was it? Just a book signing, or was it an actual like a Comic-Con or a bigger
No, it was
event?
just a book signing and a reading, so which I did at the local library and at a couple of bookstores.
Right.
But yeah, it wasn't terribly effective for me.
Well, I think you're in the same boat as most of us. I think when we do these little ones, it's nice to get out there in the community, but we don't get much take back from it. You got to do the bigger events. And as a fantasy author, if you can find some kind of medieval fair, I did a medieval fair a couple of years ago, and I sold out halfway through the first day. I couldn't believe it. And I'm like, okay, it only makes sense. And when I first thought of it, I said, medieval fair, I write fantasy. They're going to be purists, and they're not going to like witches and wizards and all that. And they absolutely ate it up. They thought it was great. So if you're going to do one, I'm sure Vancouver Island must have some, especially more down towards Victoria there. They have some bigger events you might want to check out.
Yeah, my big struggle is marketing. I mean, I have a tough time with it because I'm, first of all, an introvert, and second of all, I'm on the spectrum. I have Asperger's. I'm high functioning, but dealing with people and catching social cues, I've never been good at it. And writing was always a way. It constantly amazes me that I can come up with believable characters in that I don't understand real people.
That is pretty fantastic, though. And I did want to ask you, you have a lot of, true to life issues that are in the books, and you deal with them, in a fantasy world, which I always say that it makes it really easy to discuss tricky issues. When you discuss them in terms of a fiction book, no matter what topic, what genre it is, it's always easier, but especially in fantasy. And I really like that, you deal with opposing religions and world powers and, different races and things like that. Is that something you sort of set out to do, or was that also something that just kind of came with your writing process?
Well, in the first book, it sort of started, but I've worked cross-culturally for about 4 years. So it was really an eye-opener to me to work in another culture, especially one as foreign as Korean versus Canadian. And it opened my eyes to a lot of things. It made me really appreciate the strengths of my own culture as well as the weaknesses of my own culture, and also able to perceive and see the strengths of their culture and the weaknesses of their culture. It was a real eye-opener. And so it sort of came naturally from personal experience to have these three different species that are all call each other human of one sort or another. And just the conflict that happens because we have the Abrani who are nature worshippers, and the Anilla who are warlike and resource exploiting, and then I thought I'd do a little weird thing with the Sokai, which, I mean, they were the religious ones, the spiritual ones, but they were also technologically advanced, which we don't see very often.
I like that mix. I think it's fantastic. And they do have different skin colors, as I believe white and green skin, right?
Yes, and sort of a reddish ochre colored skin for the Sokai.
That's right.
So, but other than that, they're physically different. They have some different quirks about them, like the Anilla are basically claustrophobic and afraid of water, and the Abrani need sunlight in order to function well. If they're derived of sunlight for any great length of time, they sicken and die. And the Sokai are just they're tiny, but they're spiritually attuned to everything that's going on. And they're the ones that actually are able to perceive and see the larger cosmic conflict that's going on, which in the first book, they were really not in the picture. So the first three characters were on a voyage of discovery. They were just trying to make their way through the world, and then they discovered that there was this big thing going on behind the scenes, and they've had to band together, although they came from different cultures, and discover what their place was and discover how important they really were. I've always been in love with outsiders, because outsiders perceive culture in a different way than most people who are immersed in their own culture. And so outliers can sometimes see and make differences in the culture that couldn't ordinarily happen for somebody who just doesn't get it.
Yeah. Yeah, and now that you say that, I can, of course, see it very plainly in your books that I've read, of course. I like that.
That's very interesting. I love that about the cultures and stuff. So you got this, it was working with the Korean, an inspiration for doing the actual different cultures. Is that what inspired that in you? Or is it
that was definitely a part of it, for sure.
Yeah.
I also wanted to deal with, in society right now, the divide between ideologies is so great and so unbridgeable. That I wanted to address some of those things going on, and how somebody's got to start to build bridges.
That's right.
And I would imagine that through your book, sorry, Christy, through your books, you're building these bridges then?
Well, I'm trying.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the
Amber Rose McGovern is on. She's one of my fans. Hi, Amber.
Oh, that's awesome.
Great to have you here, Amber.
Yes. Welcome, Amber.
Yeah, I was going to say about bridging the gap, and you said, you hope that's what you're doing. And I do think that sometimes, fiction books are kind of a guide, to people as to how we can go about these things. So, I would say certainly, you show how people who are outsiders, just going off of what you said before, who are outsiders outside of a culture, their own culture, can come together to make such a big difference. And I just find that really inspiring. I love it.
Thank you.
Just to get a little more personal, I think a lot of people, we always talk about books and everything else, but authors are people too. And I know you have many different interests, and we can see behind you a new interest that has taken root, and it's going to be taking you away from your writing if you don't watch it. It's looking pretty good. But tell us a little bit about what's behind you on your wall.
Oh, behind me on the wall, I'll just move the camera a little bit so you can see a little bit more. But I took up oil painting about a year ago, and I started doing landscapes. after being inspired by Bob Ross. And so I've begun that, and I enjoy it. I don't get as much time to do it as I would like. Writing is taking up a significant amount of time, as I mentioned before we got on, Richard. I just moved to a new house, so we have all of the artwork and all of the other things to make the house our own, to make the yard our own. I do a lot of gardening, but because of the Asperger's, I kind of develop manias about certain things. I will take an interest in something, and I'll learn everything that I can about it. And then once I've learned as much as I want, I will drop it like a hot potato and go on to something else. I've done photography. I've raised tropical fish. I've made chainmail. There's just a lot of different things that I've tried and done and enjoyed in the season that I was in.
I was reading that, and I was going to ask you about that too. You made a coif, and he says the most challenging piece you could imagine because it covers the head and starts with a single ring, and it has to expand around the crown. That's it certainly does sound a little bit more difficult than just making like a sleeve or something, because the head is a multi-dimensional piece and it narrows at the neck.
Yeah, it was a challenge. I gave it to my son after I was done. I think he still has it tucked away in a box somewhere, but yeah.
Well, you got to make yourself one, so next time you do, or when you do a book show, you put the coif on, and then you don't have to worry about maintaining eye contact with people. That'll get to the table, and then you can go, and here's my books.
Well, the coif leaves the face pretty much exposed, so it is what it is.
You'll have to do it on your own.
Yeah, I mean, I can deal in two separate situations. I mean, one-on-one, I deal pretty well. In a large setting, if I'm asked to do something and there's a formal plan involved, I can stand and I can talk in front of 1,000 people and it doesn't bother me. But in an unstructured social setting, I have difficulty, and I have over the years built a template that I use, that I have this checklist that I go through, and I have to, in order to function in that kind of a situation. Otherwise, I would just disappear off somewhere and go hide.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, Patricia Schultz. Don't forget about the stained glass too. Ooh.
Oh yeah. Well, there is that as well. Yes.
Dark horse.
He's a busy guy. Like, you're not going to have any time for your writing. You're going to have to. You got to put some of these.
I will always have time for writing. That's the one thing that I've hung on to that I've never dropped.
That's good.
That is great. Do you find that any of these things that you learn, or any other forms of creativity other than writing, kind of find their way into your writing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't write outside of yourself. You can't. It's just not possible.
Right.
So much of who you are goes onto the page. It's rather frightening. It's a little bit of, exposing yourself, as it were. So it's really difficult to not write what you know, to write, and I've seen some authors, I don't know where they get this stuff from, but they write these bizarre characters that you would have to go, well, how did he come up with that? And they put themselves right into their heads, and I'm in awe of that. I think that's wonderful that they can do that. I'm not that person. Each of my characters has a little bit of me in them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And on that line, do you write some characters not just of you, but of people that you've met that have stood out in your mind? Have you purposely incorporated them into your stories, or do you see them kind of into your stories as you reread it and go, oh, hey, that's so-and-so, because he either irked you or you admired them, or...
Oh,
there you go.
Yeah. Hi, Neil. Another one of my friends. I do have some that there's little bits and snippets of who I've run into. I actually have an outline for a book that's called The Holiday, and it's more of a thriller kind of thing. It's not fantasy. And there's one character in it who I've named her Sharon, and we're going to call her Over Sharon because she shares more than she should. That's just one of the guests we had at the B&B was like that, and I went, make a great character.
That's great. Yeah, the B&B, that's right. You meet people and maybe,
Yeah,
you meet people you wouldn't have otherwise. And maybe there are some character traits there. I didn't think of that. It's a good point.
Yeah, we've had guests from all over the world. We've had them from Africa and Australia and Tasmania and lots of Europeans, lots of Germans, lots of Dutch people, a few Norwegians, some French, some Italians. The Italians were kind of fun. They were a blast.
That would certainly give you a nice diverse, when you write your characters, if you got interaction with all these different people from around the world, because truth can be stranger than fiction, and if you can draw some of the quirks out of these people and put them on your pages, that make for some well-rounded, diverse characters.
Yeah,
absolutely,
definitely. And CJ is saying she needs your checklist for when you're in large groups of people.
You're not alone, CJ. I actually had a secretary at one point who was in worse shape than I was, and so I gave her my checklist.
Awesome.
That's good.
So yeah. It's basically just a template to use in social interactions.
That's really cool. And just another thing that you've done so many different things. You're a singer in a rock band.
Yep.
So what type of rock band? There's so many different kinds of rock out there nowadays. Like, what would you be similar to? What would you compare yourself to?
I don't know. We used to do covers for groups like Queen and Nazareth, and
awesome. That's my era.
Stuff like that. Deep Purple. Various. We actually got out on the road and played in a few bars and played a few dances and did a few things, and then along came some children, and I was like, I can't be up till 3 o'clock in the morning and then drive for 4 hours to get back home, and no, not going to happen.
So were you Freddie Mercury then?
Yeah, that was me. Me and Freddie were.
I love it. That is great, though. That is really cool.
That is.
Yeah, the voice is a little ragged nowadays. I mean, and my ears, I have hearing aids because the noise level. I mean, you get off the stage and you're vibrating for like 2-3 hours afterwards.
I can imagine. Yeah.
And then we got a question. There you go. Awesome.
There we go. So we have Amber, who is asking, who is your favorite author to read?
That's a hard one. I read a lot of different authors. One of the Canadian authors I really like is Robert J. Sawyer. He writes sci-fi. He's awesome. I mean, he's some of the things he writes are just amazing. I like John Scalzi as well. I especially loved his Old Man's Brigade, The Old Man's War. That was a tremendous book. And there's just a lot of others. Neil Gaiman, another of my favorites. So, I can't say that I just have just one favorite. There are just so many out there that are amazing writers.
Now, how about Jack White? I think he recently passed away, and he was from out in BC as well.
Yes, I've read some of his stuff, the Arthurian legend stuff.
That's right. Yes, it was he's other than what's her Shelley, Mary Shelley, not Mary Shelley, Mary Stewart. Mary Stewart has a rendition of the Arthurian tales, and I really like it. But Jack White has got a rank right up there with hers.
Yeah, another one, a Canadian author I like is Guy Gabriel Kay.
Yep.
Some of his books, he's a fantastic writer too. Good old Saskatchewan boy.
Oh, I didn't realize that Guy Gabriel Kay was Canadian.
Yeah.
I think I read that recently, and I just didn't sink in there. But that's really cool. Yeah. So Jack White was from somewhere in BC. There, I don't know if he's down by.
Yeah, he was in Kelowna.
Oh, in Kelowna. Okay, right in the middle of BC.
Yeah, absolutely.
He just passed away recently, I believe.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I read that. I don't want to.
No, be writing his obituary too early.
No, I'm pretty sure I read that because I was quite taken aback by that. So
You're going to start a Twitter trending about that.
Well, another one I like is John Ringo. He's an American author. He writes predominantly military sci-fi and military fiction, and some of his stuff is just amazing. Like one of my favorite books of his is called The Last Centurion, and it's rather frightening. At the point that I read the book, the Russians were just involved in Chechnya. And I was reading about that in his book, so I went back to look at when it was published, and it was published about 3 years earlier. And some of the things he was talking about, a pandemic and global cooling and and the Chechnya issue, and I was going, where did he get this stuff from? And then the worst part was, is I saw him interviewed, and somebody asked him, well, where did this novel come from? He said, you know what? I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was there. It was all there. And I was like, freaky.
That's something. Oh my God. You know,
he wrote current events 3 years in advance.
That's amazing. I mean, sometimes if I wake up from like a nightmare, I'm saying like maybe I could write a horror book, but I don't come up with that kind of stuff. That is really something.
Yeah, it was pretty wild.
Yeah. Jennifer is asking, do you ever find inspiration from movies?
Not really. I mean, most of my inspiration comes from what's around me. I watch a lot of movies, but I can't say that I'm inspired by them. I'm inspired more by other writers.
Would you say there's any? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Would you say there's any particular fantasy author that has inspired you or that you admire in general?
I don't know. I mean, I do like Guy Gavriel Kay. He's done some good fantasy, and I do.
It's tricky.
Yeah, it is. There's so much. I mean, I read one of Richard's books, and I thought that was cool. I read Lorena.
You're muted, Richard.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, no, Lorena is actually just a side story.
Yeah.
She was, and you were talking about those little characters that become major characters. And Lorena, in book 1 of the major book, she has maybe a page and a half out of a 420-page book where you actually even see Lorena. You never see her again. She's just someone that one of the main characters bumps into, spends the night with, just to pass the time away, and you never hear him again. And then all of a sudden she comes back in book 2, about a third of the way through, because of someone else that she knows that's actually in the story. And by the end of book 3, she's a plot driving force. And so when I asked my readers who they like to hear a story about, she was one of them. So I wrote that story. And no, I'm glad you read it. I hope you liked it.
I did. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And you developed her character so well. It was rather inspiring how you got inside her head and inside her backstory. It was really good.
No, that's nice to hear. And just totally change the subject on you here. I Googled Jack White, and yes, he passed away on February 22nd, unfortunately. Yeah, so so you can sleep it tonight when you're going, oh no. Because he was certainly a great talent. And on that line, Ken, if someone asked you, and I get this a lot of times when I do book shows, they look at my books, and it's hard to get a feeling of the author, especially if you don't know them. Who would you say you write like? Other than Ken, obviously you have your.
I don't know. I don't know. I can't really say that and answer that question. I have no idea who I write like. I just try and go my own way most of the time.
No, and that's
Christy. You might have a better idea than I do how to answer that question.
I always find it difficult to find comparable titles, but if you like, I mean, the way I would describe it is if you like big worlds that have very different like feels to them, like different feels to the lands. If you like, real life concepts dealt with in a way that is digestible and characters that really grow, in each book in totally different ways, and diverse characters as well, then like that's, I have a terrible time with comparative titles, but describing it I can do. So if you like that,
So one of the things that I was trying to do in the book is to start out with these characters not knowing very much about themselves or their world, and it was just the three of them were on this journey of self-discovery. One of the inspirations I had for that, now I think when you were talking, I thought of this, was Elizabeth Moon and her Deed of Paxonarian, where this sheep farmer's daughter decides that she doesn't want to marry the guy next door. She goes off and joins the army and starts out as a grunt digging latrine pits, and then gradually works her way up. into a command position, and the amount that she knows and sees in each stage of her life, that was just, her character kept knowing and growing, and so that was, I guess that would be a motivator in my novels, is Elizabeth Moon. I actually read her novel The Speed of Dark recently, which is about autism. Her son is autistic, and oh man, I identified with him in a big way.
Yeah, I did. To go back to what you're saying about the characters, I do really love how, I mean, every book should have a good character journey, but a lot of times you can guess what the character's journey is going to be. And I can't really always guess what they're going to be with yours. You know, sometimes the people you think are going to just go down a worse path, go down a much better path, you know, and they do grow in somewhat unpredictable ways. You know, I mean, there are some characters that you can tell are good-hearted and they go down a good path, but sometimes you just don't know what to expect, and I like that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I enjoy that when I'm reading too. So I have some characters, like I mentioned in the third book, who are, you know, one of them started out fairly level and looking good, and all of a sudden he's starting to do a little bit of a nosedive, and the other guy who was just, he was, you know, you wouldn't have thought he would amount to anything. He's put upon by his brothers and his father, and he's going nowhere fast. And wait till you see book 3 or 4, Christy. He really does something special in book 4.
I'm excited. You can't tempt me like that. Now what am I doing?
I can, so.
So you've got the 3 books out now? All 3 out?
No, there's 2 out, and the third one I'm working on getting released.
Okay, and how about book 4? Is you're
book
writing
4,
now?
I have about
a timeline for it, or
that's tough.
I know some people put rigid timelines. Some people don't worry about them. They just write them, and when they come out, they come out.
I'm kind of the Douglas Adams persuasion. I love timelines or deadlines, because they make such a wonderful sound as they go whooshing by.
Yes.
So I have no idea. I am sort of working part-time at this point in my life, and between that and gardening and all of the other things that are going on in my life, I have no idea. I actually, just before I got book 3 back from Christy, I worked on book 4 for a fairly significant time period, and I added about another 10,000 words to it. So now I'm sitting at about 60,000 words on book 4.
And so what's the typical length of the first 3 books then?
They're about 80,000, 60, 70, 80,000, depending on the book. This last one, I think, was 72. No, the first one was 72,000. This one was 80 something. The last one, book 3, is like 80,000 words over.
And when you set out to write the books, do you plan on a certain, like a rough estimate word count, or you just write the story until it's done, and it just so happens that it's always around 80,000?
Actually, I tried doing the books 1 and 2, ended up sort of being a single book, and I was having trouble with that. So I ended up splitting book 1 into book 1 and 2, and I added in a bunch of additional material, because there were characters like Issel who really needed a backstory, and she didn't have much of one in the original. And so now I added a bunch of material for her, and I added some material for some of the other ones. And so it ended up being, if I would have kept it as one book, it would have been like almost 170,000 words.
Yeah.
And so it gave me more room to maneuver the characters and to develop the world and develop the plot. And so that was actually very good. The first 3 characters, Issel, Rahak, and Lakea, that's all there was in the first book, was just the 3 of them, and then we had to add. I had the idea for the Sokai, the other race, to come in, but it was just the 2 races, the Anila and the Obrani, to begin with, and then once the Sokai got involved near the end of the second book, or in the middle of the second book rather, it got a lot more interesting.
Yeah. Talking about the Sokai, they have a really amazing world there. It's very, very it's very, oh, what would you call it? Not claustrophobic, but it's like a very small area that they have to live in. And anything outside of there is very dangerous area. So they're really stuck in kind of one area, but it's a really amazing place that you built. And I always remember, like, in my head how I picture it, which is the sign of, a really good book, of course, or a really good world. So I was wondering, for like the Sokai in particular, or any of your landscapes, like, do you have inspiration that you take from elsewhere? That one struck me as pretty unique. Like, did you just come up with that yourself?
Yeah, I just did come up with that myself. When I was a teenager, I used to spend significant amount of time building worlds in my head, and what did you need to make this function, and what the parts do you need to make this all work, to make this a society that would work, that would function, that would be able to sustain itself. So I spent a lot of time doing that, and this is just kind of more of the same.
Mm.
So I find the names of your race is very interesting. Is just words that you just made up, or do they actually have some kind of meaning somewhere, or are they from different cultures that you've bumped into?
I steal things from from various places, and then I alter them. The Sokai, I mean, I live on Vancouver Island. We have sockeye salmon.
Okay. Well, I never thought of that. I was thinking more Native Indian.
Yeah. So this Sokai came out of that, and the Abrani, well, Abraham, Abrani, Inilla, I don't know where I came up with that one, but yeah, so I do steal that. Some of the characters, like, for example, Ibera and Kiona in the second book, they are names of young ladies that I met. One was a server at a restaurant. Her name was Kiona, or no, it was Ibera, and she's Filipino. And I just asked her, I said, can I use your name in the book? She, nice. Yeah, that's great. And Kiona was a cashier at a PetSmart. And I said, that's a really cool name. Can I use it? She was about 16 or 17 years old. And she was just, I'm going to be in a book. Oh, I'm so excited.
That's fantastic. I was wondering where your names came from too. Mm-hmm. I've always wondered about that, actually.
And some of them I pull out of baby name books, like Rehak as a Czechoslovakian kind of name. I have a Czech friend who recognizes that right away. Mm-hmm. And Lakea is actually a Hawaiian name. There you go.
Yeah.
It's got some pretty obscure names in there too. I've had that probably since 1980. Probably.
And sometimes you can just take a regular name and just change a few letters around and make it into something special too.
Sure.
Yeah, for sure. Especially in fantasy, because the naming conventions are now. Speaking of naming conventions, do you have any kind of convention with your names, or you just throw names out there?
I just throw them out there.
Yeah, I do the same thing.
Yeah, and it's easier that way. I know. I mean, you're talking about how hard fantasy is in the terms of world building. I don't think fantasy is actually that hard as world building. I think what is really challenging, and I would never attempt to do, is hard science fiction. You just need to know too much science.
Yeah.
People will freak out on you all over the place. Understand the science. What are you talking about? That doesn't
exactly. That's the joy of being a fantasy writer, is I can put a purple sky up there and a pink tree, and you can't say it's not there because it's my world. It's my pink tree. So
exactly.
That's so true.
In some ways, it's just so much easier to write fantasy than it is to write hard sci-fi.
I agree. The only research I find myself doing is like tides in a lake, or something that's kind of real to life. That some things have to be real, even though it's a fantasy world, just to make it the whole story plausible. But
I did a lot of research on blacksmithing and weapon making, for sure. Because one of my characters was a blacksmith and a weapon maker. But, there's a twist, because this special metal that comes only from this one little island in my world, and they've lost it. It cannot be manipulated with a forge. It needs to be manipulated with a person's mind in the aether, which is the spiritual realm. And you build it crystal by crystal. it's not something that you can do that. We started out with metal, we started out with steel, we started out with that. But I did need to know a few things about it, and that sort of got me hooked on the TV series Forged in Fire. So there you go.
Wow. Nice. Knowing you probably made your own sword before you wrote it, because you pick up all kinds of crafts and you perfect them.
No, I actually didn't. I started out, my first career actually was in welding. And so I ended up doing some metal crafting. I was building something out of steel that I was forging it basically. And one of the guys, the other welders, came by and he goes, "You should be a blacksmith."
There you go. And now your character is.
That's
now
awesome.
My character is. So you see, it's all there. I'm a little bit there in everything.
So just before we go, Ken, is there anything that you want to add to what's going on with in Ken Schultz's fantasy world, the Songs of Arda? Is there anything special that you'd like to let us know about? Is there audiobooks coming down the road, or you got plans for another series after this one? What's going to be happening in Ken Schultz's world the next year or so?
I'm really trying to focus on getting book 3 or book 4 and 5 done. And once I'm done those, I want to pick up this other thing, which is called The Holiday, which is basically a thriller.
Right.
It's a story of, and Chrissy, you're talking about all of the different things. That this book is about a Christian couple who loses their son, and a friend gives them this holiday to Thailand. While they're in Thailand, they get kidnapped. A busload of them gets kidnapped. And on the bus, there's this Christian couple, an older couple that are not a couple of gay guys on their honeymoon. A guy who's a sex tourist. And so the dynamics of these people having to work together to get out of the mess that they're in. There's also an American businesswoman, a Black American businesswoman who has gone to Thailand to set up a factory. And while she's gone, she's kidnapped. She's expecting her board of directors to ransom her. And they decide they want to get rid of her. In the meantime, so there's a lot of stuff going on in that. But that's an outline.
I love it. I already love it.
So I really want to get to that one.
I can imagine.
That sounds awesome, Ken.
I sort of pitched that to a few people, and they go, "I want to read that one."
Yeah.
No, that's good. No, that's great. I like the stories behind it. All these different storylines you have within the people in the bus. For sure. So with Christy and I would like to thank you, Ken, for joining us today on Lurking for Legends, and we wish you well with the rest of your Songs of Arda series, and when you get into your next genre, and hopefully that goes well for you as well. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Ken. It's been great.
And thank you, Christy. Thank you, Richard.
Oh, you're most welcome. We were glad to have you. So next week, so make sure you check out Ken's fantasy series, Songs of Arda. And next week, March 16th, we're going to have fantasy author. Sorry, Christy, you got fantasy authors twice. We're taking over. That was 2 weeks in a row. Josh Lioncourt. And Christy, you can tell us something very special about Josh. You mentioned that just before we went on air.
He's an amazing epic fantasy author. You guys are going to love him. And he happens to be blind as well. And shockingly, he has the fewest amount of errors I've probably ever seen in terms of typos and commas and things like that. He's really on top of it. He's just an amazing person all the way around. So I'm super excited to have him on.
That's awesome. Cool. So Josh is the author of an epic fantasy series called The Dragon's Brood Cycle. So it should be a very good one next week, and it'd be very interesting to talk to Josh and see how he goes about his business, because I go about my business, I can see quite well. So I imagine the different challenges that he's had to put up with, especially writing text and stuff like that. So it'd be very interesting to talk to Josh. So for Christy and myself and Ken Schultz, who joined us today, we wish everybody a good night, and we hope everyone stays well, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, everyone.